In advance of tomorrow's midseason episode, which is a new interview with Eric Carter-Landin, we're re-releasing our original interview with Eric from 2022. In this original episode, he covers his brother Jacob's case in great detail, as well as his fight to have charges pursued. We encourage you to re-listen so you'll be caught up for tomorrow's release. It remains one of our most popular interviews to date. Jacob's story and what Eric and his mother have gone through are heartbreaking, and their current pursuit of justice needs a national audience, now more than ever. This episode discusses child abuse, contains brief mentions of sexual abuse, and discusses domestic violence. Listener discretion is advised. This is The Fall Line. Eric Carter-Landin is creator and host of True Consequences, a true crime podcast that covers cases in New Mexico, his home state. But unlike most independent podcasters, he has an extremely personal connection to the research he does. He's been inexorably tied to a homicide case since 1987, when his little brother, Jacob, was murdered. Jacob Landin was born on July 1st, 1986, and died only 9 months later, in April of 1987. Though Jacob's autopsy showed clear signs of physical abuse, no one was ever charged with his death, and his case was closed. Eric and his mother, both of whom would be victimized by Jacob's alleged murderer, tried to pursue his case. Once they were in a safe situation and Eric was older, they gained access to case information that shocked them both. But instead of achieving justice for Jacob, they ran into roadblock after roadblock, constructed by a complex system that didn't have support available for Eric's mother. And time was not on their side. Decades later, Eric is one of a growing number of family creators in the true crime space. Like Sarah Turney of Voices for Justice, Eric and other family members are asking audiences to stop thinking of families and their experiences as simple content, the object of a story, and begin to position them as the subjects. To think of them as people who are both exposed and powerful, and who should have a lot of say in how this industry is run. After all, it is literally fueled by their lives. We sat down with Eric to discuss Jacob's story, the Justice for Jacob movement, the unique role of a family creator in the true crime space, and much more. It was a really fascinating and moving conversation. We think you'll enjoy listening as much as we enjoyed having it. So, Eric, you've been hosting True Consequences for actually almost 3 years now, but you've been focused on crime in New Mexico for way longer than that. I know that in particular, you've been researching family violence and child abuse in the state for much longer than you've been a podcaster. That work, understanding the failings and gaps in the systems in New Mexico, were something you took on to learn how you could advocate for your own brother. Is that correct? And can you tell us about that and about Jacob?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll start with Jacob because I think that's the best place to start. He was a baby brother that I prayed for. My family was very religious. I was brought up in a really religious home. My dad was a Pentecostal evangelist. And so I prayed for Jacob. I really wanted him to be born and to have a sibling to play with. And so I was super excited when I found out my mom was pregnant with him. My family went through a bunch of stuff, and I'm not going to go through the blow by blow because I think, that'll take forever. But my family was struggling. My father was preaching and he was traveling around the country and would leave my mom alone for long periods of time without any resources, without any money. And we were starving. We were struggling. We had to rely on the kindness of strangers to make sure that we had food. And luckily, there were people that were helping us out because my father was kind of checked out. And so when my parents separated, my mom ran into this person that she had known for a very long time, her whole life. His father actually married my parents. His father was a minister in Socorro, New Mexico, where I'm from. His sister was married to my mom's brother. So our families are very connected. There's a lot more to that. But I want to say that because it's I think, an important part of the story, because this guy understood what was happening in my mom's life at the time, and he kind of swooped in and started to love bomb us both. And my mom started having a relationship with this person. He kind of, snuck his way in there. And within a matter of weeks, Jacob started to have injuries on his body that were unexplainable. And shortly after that happened, Jacob had a head injury that resulted in a brain bleed, and he had to have fluid drained from his skull cavity. And so my mom's boyfriend at the time blamed me and said that I had kicked Jacob in the head because I was jealous of him. And my mom wasn't sure what to think, so she sent me to live with my dad and started to really limit how much contact her boyfriend had with Jacob. And then there was one night where there was nobody available to watch Jacob, and it was about an hour left in my mom's shift, and she told my grandmother to take Jacob to her boyfriend because it was only an hour. And in less than an hour, within probably 45 minutes, her boyfriend comes running into the grocery store that she was working in a panic, saying that Jacob wasn't breathing and he was unconscious. And at the same time, an ambulance is driving by really fast on the road to the hospital. So my mom and him got in the car. They drove to the hospital. Jacob's injuries were so severe that he had to be airlifted to Albuquerque, which is about 75 miles north of Socorro. He was rushed into emergency surgery and he didn't survive. Official cause of death on the autopsy is blunt force trauma that resulted in fluid building up in his lungs, and it worsened the brain injury that he had already had previously because he was still recovering from that. So that was a very powerful moment in my life, as you can imagine. I was in California. We were woken up very early in the morning to the news that my brother was being rushed to the hospital for surgery. By the time we landed in Albuquerque, my brother had already died. And it was horrible. And we weren't really sure what had happened. This person we didn't think was capable of doing these kinds of things. We've known him. Everybody knows him. He's seemingly a great person. He's funny, he's friendly, he's outgoing, he loves kids. The investigation happened pretty much immediately. I was questioned by police, my mom, my grandmother, pretty much the whole family. And my mom's boyfriend kept maintaining his innocence. He kept saying things like, it was an accident. His story changed, I think, like 6 or 7 times. And I remember he continued to try to get my mom to go back with him. But my mom's boyfriend went to get a polygraph exam, and we went with him because they were starting to talk again. And within a couple of hours, he walked out of the state police office, and my mom asked him how it went. And he said, "I passed. It's fine." And because he walked out, we believed him. But it turns out he actually failed that polygraph. And I know that in a lot of municipalities and states, polygraphs are no longer admissible in court, but it is in New Mexico still. So that kind of resulted in a long relationship, about 3 years with my mom with this man. And as soon as she married him, he became very abusive to both of us, physically, emotionally, mentally, sexually, just everything that you could think of. It was 3 years of hell and torture. And there was something that happened when my mom was being questioned. The police asked her if she thought her boyfriend was capable of doing this to Jacob. And her reply was, "I don't think so." Because, like I said, we didn't think so. After she left him, she went to the district attorney. She went to the police. She asked the district attorney to press charges against him for Jacob's murder. And they said that they wouldn't do that because she had given him an alibi. And what they're referring to is when she said she didn't think he was capable. of hurting Jacob, which everyone is probably shaking their head listening to that, is not an alibi. Nobody could alibi him because he was alone with Jacob that night. It's a head trauma case. It's a child abuse case. It's an old case. And so from that moment on, my mom and I started really trying to fight to get the attention of the authorities, to get the attention of the district attorney, to try to get something to happen in the case, to get the case moving. And DAs would change. We would campaign with them to try to get them to do something. And nothing ever happened. And so I was feeling defeated, really. I was feeling very hopeless, I think is probably the best word for it. We filed a police report about the sexual abuse that I endured, and nothing happened. There was no movement, no arrest, nothing happened. So, he had tried to groom my 14-year-old cousin for sexual abuse. She went to the police as well. My mom talked about the amount of abuse that she endured. He was never arrested. He played basketball with law enforcement every weekend. It's a small town. They all knew him. He worked for the county. He had friends in every county office, including the DA's office. So he was able to walk away from all of the damage and harm that he caused to me and my mom and my brother and my entire family. This event, it broke my family. We've never been the same since it happened. So I made it my mission to try to find a way to bring justice for Jacob. And as I grew up into an adult, I started to see cases coming through the New Mexico court system that were very similar to Jacob's story. A person who is supposed to be responsible for a child's safety and well-being is abusing them, resulting in their death. And I was trying to wrap my mind around why New Mexico continues to fail its children. And as you can imagine, it's a very nuanced, very complicated answer to that question. We are one of the poorest states in the country. Now, our state government has money, has billions and billions of dollars, but when I talk about poverty, it's relating to households and families. And we have generational poverty. We're one of the smallest states, not in terms of landmass. In terms of landmass, we're huge, but there's only 2 million people that live here. And 1 million of them live in Albuquerque. And the rest are scattered amongst the 5th largest landmass in the country. Education. We don't have a strong tax base here because of the poverty. And our education system is not doing a great job. It's under-resourced, especially in communities of color, especially in communities where the primary population is in poverty. Those schools are underfunded and under-resourced. And that adds to the challenges. So you've got all of these stressors, and then you throw in domestic violence and you throw in child abuse that comes, from generational issues, but also through poverty and drug abuse and all those other things that we know influence those things, but also the generational side of it where kids are growing up in violent households and then they're trying to make their way out of that. But sometimes they go back into that, and become perpetrators themselves. All of those things make for a perfect storm in the state. And then our Child Protective Services, just like every other Child Protective Service office in the country, is underfunded. It's overworked. The people there are handling way more cases than they should. And every time they try to fix it, it isn't enough. So it's not like an easy solution that we can just turn on a switch and everything's magically better. We have to address this from every single angle. And honestly, I don't think that politics is going to be the way to solve that because it's just so volatile, But that's kind of how I started. And I wanted to make a difference. And I kept saying to my family that somebody should do something about this. Somebody should say something about what's happening here, because it's a huge problem. And I kept waiting for somebody to do it, for somebody to stand up. And there were some politicians that stood up and said things, and there were some people that said things, but one day I just said, you know what? I'm going to say something. I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to try to bring awareness to the minds of the people in this state, so that we can be smarter about the way that we're voting, so that we can think about, who do we want representing us in the legislature? Who do we want fighting for these kids, for these families? And so I created the podcast. I had no idea, I have no formal training in, audio production or any of that. I have an MBA. I'm a business major. I'm not a journalist. So all of this was a huge learning curve for me. And it's been a journey, and definitely was not easy to start, but I feel like I've come a long way.
This leads me to a lot of questions, both, I think, about your journey learning from all the failings in Jacob's case, and also learning from producing True Consequences, either at the time of Jacob's death or later as an adult, because I know that you and your mom went back and really dug into his case. Did you have access to advocates or any victim support at all?
No. And, this was the late 80s when we first got access to the file. And I think that they gave us a lot more than they should have given us, because none of it was redacted. So we've got social security numbers, birth dates, all kinds of personal identifying information that would not happen today, hopefully. I haven't seen any in my FOIA requests, so I think it's pretty standard now. So we got a lot of stuff that we probably shouldn't have received. I think that they were just really tired of us, so they just handed us a copy of everything. They wanted to get us out of their hair. We did go back to the state police eventually and ask them to reopen the case. And that was, I believe, in 2000, I want to say 2003 or 2004. I don't remember exactly when it was. They reviewed the case, and they went through, and Sergeant Christensen went back and went through everything. But no, we didn't have support from services. And I don't even know if services like that existed in New Mexico at that time. Or if they did, they probably weren't in my rural community. I probably would have had to come to Albuquerque to access any kind of services like that. My mom, was a single mother working as a waitress. She, I think, had like a 9th grade education at the time. So she was very overwhelmed by the daunting task of trying to fight for justice for your son when you don't have money and you don't really understand how the system works. And so I feel like that would have been beneficial for us to have somebody to guide us through that process. But we really didn't have. The only thing we were given, and it wasn't, I don't think, through the courts or through the police or anything like that, was we got counseling. I think that was my mom wanting to try to pick up the pieces of our lives. And we got it for free because we were poor. But that was pretty much it.
Something that she sought out.
Yeah.
Something that you brought up to me that I found really, really shocking, and I think it will be shocking to listeners who haven't heard Jacob's story before either, is the statute of limitations that applies to his case.
Yeah, I get a lot of comments from people like, what are you talking about? There's no statute of limitations on murder. And that might be true in your state or in your municipality or, wherever you are in the world. But in New Mexico, up until recently, there was a statute of limitations on second-degree murder. And that was one of the big things that was preventing anybody from wanting to look at the case or even try to prosecute it in any meaningful way. And that was a very frustrating part for me to learn about as an adult, because like everybody else, I felt there shouldn't be a statute of limitations on murder, even if it is second degree. It doesn't make any sense even if you negligently cause the death of somebody. You cause the death of somebody. That's, the most egregious thing that you could do in our justice system or in our country. So it was a shock to me. And it wasn't until I asked for help from the Attorney General that I learned that sometime after we went to the cold case unit with the state police, the legislature of New Mexico repealed that part of the code. And so they removed the statute of limitations on second-degree murder, which doesn't always go back retroactively. But what happened was there was a case that came through the courts shortly after that and went to the Supreme Court where somebody asked for charges to be pressed against a person who caused the murder of somebody else. And the Supreme Court agreed that because of the new law, it would apply. There would no longer be a statute of limitations for second-degree murder. And so that's opened the door for precedents for anybody else going forward now to argue that, there's case law that supports the fact that we can go back and say there's no longer a statute of limitations. Let's try this case. So that was exciting. It didn't move as fast as I wanted it to when I found that out, because I had to go back to the DA and ask him to do it again. And he refused.
And to my understanding, another frustrating factor is that there is in the transcripts and records that you've accessed a confession, correct?
Yeah, allegedly.
Allegedly.
So, and I say that because when you look at the case file, there's a little moment where there's some narrative from one of I think it's like the sergeant who's investigating. And he said, so-and-so came into my office to let me know that we no longer needed to conduct a polygraph because the suspect confessed. And then there's no record of the confession. There's no documentation of it. There's no recording, at least that we know of. I know that they are trying to find that, but that's all we have. And I actually just learned that a couple of years ago. I didn't know that he had confessed. And that makes it even more of, salt in the injury situation for us, because why didn't they do anything if he confessed?
Do you have any clarity as to why the DA didn't move forward at the time with the evidence that they had on hand? Have you been able to get anyone to give you any insight into that?
I can only speculate, and I don't like to speculate. So my canned response that I always give when I get asked this question is, at best, it's just negligence. At worst, there's some sort of collusion/corruption involved in the case. And it could be a mix of both. It could be somewhere in between. But that's really all I could ascertain just based on my experience. And that's really not grounded in the facts. So I just know how we were treated and what we were told.
Have you ever felt the need to back off advocating for Jacob's case?
Yeah, I do, or I have. Actually, recently, I kind of stopped talking about the case because I was hoping that I would see some more movement if I gave space for an investigation to happen. That's the opposite of what happened. So I'm back on it again.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how social media has played into your reaching out to get attention for Jacob's case, and also talk a little bit about your petition.
So shortly after I started the podcast, decided that I was going to really start to put the pressure on the elected officials who could make or break this case. I learned that, and I think this is probably true everywhere, but I learned that in New Mexico, prosecutors really get to decide whether or not they bring a case to trial. It can be based on anything, really. I mean, they could just say, I don't feel like I'm going to win this, so I'm not going to prosecute it. And that's always bothered me. That's always been something that's frustrated me. And so I kind of had this idea through Sarah's inspiration, honestly. And so I decided, okay, maybe I can do this. Maybe I can make a petition. I didn't know what was going to happen when I did that. I didn't honestly think that anything was going to happen when I created the petition, just because for so long, we would do so much and it wouldn't go anywhere. And then other creators started to pay attention to Jacob's story. And that's honestly the best thing that could have ever happened for the case, because it got so many eyes and ears on Jacob's story that it was now politically unpopular to ignore us. And honestly, I think that's what it takes to get these people to do their job sometimes.
So, speaking of effects on the case, you recently made an announcement regarding Jacob's case. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this was something that I had kept quiet for a year, which is really hard for me. Anybody who knows me knows that I am not good at keeping secrets, especially if it's good news. I have a really hard time with that. I want everyone to have their birthday and Christmas presents like 2 weeks before, because I just can't take it. So I kept this a secret for a year, and everybody who knows me is shocked. So I think it was in 2021. Yes. I did a call to action to everybody who had heard Jacob's story. And I asked all the creators who had covered his case to help me to publicize it. And we did what we called the 10 Days of Jacob. And it started on April 1st, and it went until April 10th, which was the anniversary of his death. The call to action was for those that cared about Jacob's case to, first of all, sign the petition. And then secondarily, if they could, call, email, or write a letter to the district attorney in Socorro County to ask him to reopen Jacob's case. Because this was when we had found out about the statute of limitations issue, which was the most recent excuse that he had given us. So when we found that out, and the attorney general was the one that told us that, the attorney general wrote a letter to the district attorney saying, "We believe that you can prosecute this. We believe that this case is winnable. We will give you whatever resources you need to prosecute this case." And then the DA didn't respond to anybody. So I decided to do the 10 Days of Jacob. And the DA lasted 2 days before he emailed me and asked me to make it stop. And so he not only emailed me to ask me to make it stop, but he also emailed the attorney general. And he said, "I can't do this. I've got a small staff. I can't handle all these phone calls and emails. I'm going to turn the case over to you." And so in New Mexico, I don't know how jurisdictions work in other places, but in New Mexico, the AG cannot step in on a case unless the district attorney turns that case over to them. And so while he didn't say, "I'm going to prosecute this case," he gave us the biggest gift he could have given us by getting it out of that county, which has been a huge hassle for us. And so the attorney general agreed to take the case on and reopen the investigation in April of 2021.
So, this is something that maybe most of our listeners don't know. And I actually didn't realize because I met you through Jacob's case. But you actually started True Consequences not with Jacob's case, right? You started with other cases.
Mm-hmm.
So, I was hoping you could talk to us about that. And then you could also talk about your decision, A, to not start with Jacob's case, to start with other cases, and then your decision to eventually cover Jacob's case on the podcast.
Sure. I'm a very private, somewhat shy person. I don't like having the sordid details of my life on the internet. It's not something that I've ever wanted. But I wanted to help, like I said, I wanted to help people in my community who were fighting for justice, because I know what it's like to be ignored by the system. I know what it's like to be gaslit by the system and to feel like you don't have anyone to talk to and you don't have anywhere to go and that nobody understands what you're going through. And I wanted to create a space where somebody did understand, where somebody would allow them to tell their story in their words, on their terms, without having to worry about being edited for context, without having to worry about me not wanting to talk to them because they don't have anything new to talk about. I just wanted to create this love letter to Jacob and to my community. So I started with the most famous true crime case in New Mexico because I wanted people to listen. So I figured if I did something like that, then maybe it would get people's attention. And I was able to interview Cynthia Vigil Jaramillo, who escaped from the Toy Box Killer. She was my first interview that I'd ever done. We did it in my kitchen. The sound quality is terrible, but it was such a powerful experience to talk to her and to see somebody who has gone through the worst imaginable thing that could happen to anybody, and to have her in that moment of like, I'm going to die if I don't get out of here. Like, it was just incredible. And so from there, I started talking to family members, and I was having a conversation with the mother of Colin Romero. And I told her something along the lines of, we can't ignore these problems away. If we're not willing to talk about them, we can't expect them to change. And I kind of punched myself in the gut with that statement and put the mirror in front of my face and realized that I was being hypocritical in that moment because I wasn't willing to talk about Jacob's story, because I didn't want to let all those skeletons out of my family's closet. And so I left that interview pretty shaken up, and I immediately called my mom. And I said, Mom, I just had this experience and I told this person this, and I'm feeling like a hypocrite now. And I want to tell Jacob's story because I feel like we can't ignore this problem away. We can't pretend like it's not happening. We need to do something about it. And I said, would you be interested in joining me in telling the story? And she didn't hesitate. She said, yes, absolutely. I was so nervous to talk to my mom about it. That was the first time we had ever talked about Jacob together. We had never even sat down and had that conversation because my family was so traumatized by Jacob's death that my grandmother had forbid us from even mentioning his name. And so I was very nervous, not just for what I had to say, but I was nervous about my mom's ability to get through that process. I didn't want to re-traumatize her, and I didn't want to cause her to suffer. So I was being a little extra, if you need to stop, let me know. Or that was a nightmare to edit because I kept interrupting her. I was just so concerned about her. But when it was over, there was this, it's cliche, but there was this catharsis. There was this moment where we both felt some relief from all of this pain and torture that we've been holding on to for 33 years. And we started to kind of heal. There were a lot of questions that I had that I didn't know the answer to, and she was able to answer those for me. And so if you listen to that episode, you're going to hear some really raw, emotional conversation. And all of that is real. All of that was in the moment, very intense, very difficult conversation, but it was also very beautiful in a way because I feel like in that moment, at least for myself, my mom's boyfriend no longer had power over me. That story was no longer like this dark secret that was festering inside of me. Brought it out into the light, and the response was incredible. I mean, there was some negativity, of course, because it's the internet, but for the most part, there was a lot of compassion and I got a lot of people that emailed me and said, essentially, me too. And that felt good to know that we weren't alone, even though it felt like we were. There are so many people out there that have gone through what we've gone through, or, something similar. And that's beautiful. There's this beautiful community of people who understand and who care and who get it, because not everybody gets it.
Looking back, are you glad that you structured it the way that you did, that you started with other cases and that you sort of organically moved to Jacob's and didn't start with his?
I am. I'm very glad that I went the route that I did. it was unintentional. I didn't set out for it to happen like that. But I think that I had a decent foundation going into that interview with my mom, where I had done several interviews. And so it was a little bit, I think, easier because I didn't have to worry so much about all the technical stuff. I mean, the sound quality isn't great in that episode because we did it at my mom's mobile home. But I don't know. There was something really special about that moment. And I think that I was better prepared for it because of the way that I approached it, and because I had already talked to several family members, and I had talked to several mothers who had lost their kids. And so it made me feel a little bit more confident having that conversation with my mom, and also being able to stay somewhat professional. My emotions definitely still got involved in that episode, but I think I was able to execute it better because of the way that I approached things.
So, in terms of the cases that you choose for True Consequences, I think beyond the focus on New Mexico, can you talk more about how you choose the cases? Are they both current and cold? Do you look at both pressing cases? Are you looking for cases that have the most urgent action items, petitions? How do you approach that?
So I have 3 kind of buckets that I work from. The biggest bucket and the most important bucket in my mind is cases that are unresolved or unsolved that need awareness. So that's my number one go-to bucket for choosing cases. And that comes to me through a variety of ways. Listeners will recommend cases sometimes. Family members often will come to me and ask me to cover the case. So those get the priority. I also secondarily, and maybe slightly smaller bucket, is cases that tell the story of why New Mexico is the way that it is, that illustrate certain laws or illustrate certain deficiencies that we have in our justice system. And these cases may be solved. They may be unsolved, but the majority of them are solved. And they're always kind of with that idea of, this is why X, Y, and Z happens in New Mexico, or this is what it looks like when X, Y, and Z happens in New Mexico. And then the third bucket, which is much smaller than the other 2, is cases that are interesting to me or that give me a little bit of a break from some of the doom and gloom that I cover on a regular basis. So sometimes I'll do a historical case like Billy the Kid, just because it's interesting to me and it gives me a little bit of a reprieve and a little bit of a breath, but I still get to put out some content for my listeners that may be a different take on the story that they're used to hearing.
I know that when we started podcasting 5 years ago, there were few, if any, family creators at the time. I would love for you to talk to me about how you see the industry changing with the advent of family creators like you and like Sarah and others, and how that could change things. I don't expect you to be psychic, but like how you think things could change in 5 years, 10 years even, with families coming forward and saying, we're not the material, we are the people who are here to say something about this because it's our lives.
Yeah, I think it's overdue. I think that this voice has been missing from the conversation for way too long. I think that the days of sensationalized, speculative, and predatory content creation are coming to an end. We're seeing that in how people are responding to Sarah Turney, for example, how people are responding to me, even to a smaller degree, but definitely starting to see that there's interest. People want to hear from the family members who are involved in these cases, and not so much as like a trauma porn situation, more of a, how can we help this family pick up the pieces? How can we step in as a community and be less exploitive and make a difference? I think my hope is that that continues to progress, and that we see some of the creators who have dug in their heels and want to berate family members or tell lies about family members and what's happening in their lives, to villainize them in order to push their agenda or their narrative on a case because it's made them so much money. My hope is that those days are coming to an end, and that what we're going to see is the listeners start to move away from that type of content and to engage with people like Sarah, people like The Fall Line, people who are actively creating calls to action and trying to do things to move the needle for the family. Because it's not enough to listen to these cases. If you really care about the victims, then it's time to stop just saying it, and it's time to actually show it, because your words really don't mean a lot, unfortunately. The actions do. And I think that action and advocacy focused true crime is the future of true crime.
I mean, we talk a lot about, I think, being respectful of victims and even being victim-centered, but I don't think we talk a lot about what those words mean. What does respect mean? What does being centered mean? Does it mean describing someone in a way that's respectful, or should it go a lot further than that? You mentioned action items, right? You mentioned actually supporting a case, right? But are there other things you're looking for too?
Well, I think there's things that I'm not looking for, right? I'm not looking for victim blaming. I'm not looking for, calling into question the character of a victim who was murdered because they maybe used drugs or were in sex work or whatever they were doing in their lives. I don't believe that there are any throwaway people. I believe that everybody is loved by somebody, and we should treat the cases with that lens in mind. I think empathy is something that is sorely lacking in a lot of true crime shows, specifically on television. And I think that that's something that you can't pretend to have, right? You either are empathetic or you're not. I think that empathy goes a long way. And then the other thing I think is really important is intention. Intention is like 90% of being respectful to the family members. If you're going in there with the intention of being helpful, with the intention of bringing awareness, with the intention of making a difference, then you pretty much can't go wrong. I'm sure that you could probably say something, but it's not about being perfect. It's about being aware, and it's about making adjustments when you fall short. I'm not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and I've said things on the show that I regret, but I've changed and I've evolved and I've adjusted. And I think that's, rather than being obstinate and digging your heels in when you're confronted by somebody saying, hey, you probably shouldn't say this like that, take that moment to have that introspection and then adjust. I think that's really all that you could hope for.
What can we do as creators to better serve families?
I think we talked about this a little bit earlier before we started recording, and it's the same approach that I take, and I think that it's the right approach. It may not be for some people, but it is for me, which is I will not release an episode without a family member listening to it first and letting me know if there's anything that needs to be changed or it needs to be taken out. I don't think a lot of people understand how sensitive things and information can be in these cases sometimes. And some information cannot be talked about publicly. That's always been a huge fear for me with Jacob's case. We can't mention the suspect's name because of the laws in New Mexico, because of the constitutional right to a speedy trial in New Mexico. The second he's mentioned in media, if he hasn't been charged yet, they can start ticking the clock on speedy trial. And so it's a quick way to make sure that we have a mistrial immediately without even having started. And so those things terrify me. I never want to be the person who screws up a case because I let the wrong piece of information out. And so not only is it a check for the family member to see if they are okay with the content, but it's also a check for me to make sure that I'm not going to jeopardize the case for their loved one. And I think that consciousness and that awareness is something that can be missing in some true crime shows. And I think it's something that is sorely needed because family members want to feel safe. They're trusting you with their most vulnerable memory, the most vulnerable moment in their life, probably the worst day of their life. And we need to treat that with due care.
How about audiences? What do audiences owe the families whose content they're consuming? What do you think?
If you're an audience member who cares about the victims, who cares about the outcome of these cases, who cares about finding missing people, then maybe consider doing a little bit more than listening. Maybe consider signing a petition. Maybe consider sharing the episode. It seems like a little thing, but it means so much. When Jacob's episode gets shared, it means that more people are listening to his story. And that helps me. Not everybody has money to donate to these kinds of causes. And a share goes just as far as $1, if not further sometimes. Because it could get into the ears of somebody who does have $1, like all of that adds up. So if you care about these cases, even if it's just the smallest thing like a share, that helps so much. If you are somebody who doesn't care, I can't stop you from listening, but I really wish you wouldn't,
How do you think that traditional media could better serve families?
I think a lot of the same things apply. Less sensationalism, less speculation. I know it's hard not to focus on ratings and listens. It's hard, but it shouldn't be about that if you're going to tell these stories. I mean, this isn't a movie. This isn't a TV show. This isn't fiction. It's real. And the actions of the media have real consequences in the lives of the people that they're telling these stories about. And so I think the same thing applies. Like more empathy, more willingness to help tell these stories, even when maybe there isn't something new and exciting to talk about. If the family is still fighting for justice, I think that should be news enough. Why is the DA not doing their job? That's a cover. That's a headline. That will give you ratings. So I think that there are opportunities to change the way we think about these cases, to change the way we think about the people involved in these cases, and to change the way we interact with the family members and the way that we interact with the victims. And there's so many other issues with race and socioeconomics that come into play when it comes to traditional media outlets. I can tell you that there was not one article, not one news video about Jacob's case ever until I started talking about it. He was a poor brown boy. The media needs to care about poor people of color.
Yeah. And that is not something that is unique to the 80s or the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
We see more stories now because of social media, but that doesn't mean that the stories are having the same kind of coverage or the same kind of national impact.
Exactly.
How do you define ethical true crime? What should it do? What should it be? What is it,
Well, I would say ethical true crime is not harmful. I think that you have to throw in some trauma-informed conversations to make it ethical. I feel like a broken record, but speculation and sensationalism, in my opinion, are not ethical. Stick to the facts. Tell the story. These stories are horrible enough. We don't have to make them worse. You can make a story compelling without speculating and sensationalizing. It's possible. You can make the story compelling. It's in how you tell it. And then also consent goes a long way. There's documentaries being made about family members' cases that they don't want made. They've had to go to social media to ask people to sign petitions to ask big streaming services not to cover these cases because whatever their reason is, it doesn't matter. If they said no, that should be enough, in my opinion.
Can you give us some action items for Jacob's case?
Absolutely. You can listen to Jacob's story on pretty much any of the episodes that have been done about him on any creator. So if there's a favorite creator you have and it's not me, you can hear his story in a bunch of different places. You can watch his story on a couple of YouTube channels as well. You can listen to myself and my mom having a conversation about Jacob's story. And there are several, I believe I have 4 episodes about Jacob.
And we'll link to those in the show notes.
Thank you. Sign the petition. We're still trying to put pressure on the Attorney General to wrap up the investigation. We don't want to rush him, but we want to see some movement and some progress in the investigation to know that we are moving in the right direction. This Attorney General is going to be out of office come January, and we'll have a new Attorney General. We have elections in November. It's going to be important to keep this pressure up because the pressure we had got the current Attorney General involved. There's nothing to say that the new person will be interested or invested in covering Jacob's case. So the more signatures I have on that petition, the more of a show of force or awareness that we have in writing. Lawyers love writing. So we have it in writing. That helps a lot. Share the petition, share the episodes, and keep in touch with me, or keep in touch with Laurah's feed on the Fall Line. If we have calls to action coming out, I'm hoping that we'll be able to publicize those on social media and get people rallied to do whatever we need to do. We might need to do another phone call situation with the new Attorney General, but yeah, reach out to me if you want to know what else you can do. But for now, those are the big things that will help Jacob's case.
So sign, share, and follow Eric's social media. Thank you so much for joining me today, Eric. I really enjoyed this.
Me too. Thank you for having me.
You can find a link to the Justice for Jacob petition and to Eric's social media in our show notes. Please be sure to follow True Consequences so you can keep up with Jacob's case. You can also find a link to subscribe to Eric's show. It's available everywhere you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening. If you know of a case that should be covered on the Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. The Fall Line is an independently produced show, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And if you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon. We're raising Patreon funds to continue to pay the monthly rent on the Millbrook Twins billboard and to fund therapy for families who've been on the show. Each and every one of our patrons helps us to continue this work, and we're so grateful for your help. On Patreon, you can get early release, ad-free versions of our regular episodes for only $5 a month. 100% of those proceeds go to the billboard and therapy funds. You can also contribute as little as $1 a month to support those initiatives. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laurah Norton, with additional research by Brian Waters, Kiana Burgess, and Michaela Morrill. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Line editing by Bill Bertschinger. Content advisement by Brandy C. Williams, Liv Fallon, and Vic Kennedy. Our most special thanks to Angie Dodd and Sarah Turney. Currently, our monthly donation is going to private investigations for the missing. Please join us in supporting this nonprofit. They need funds to help families access the services of PIs.